What was day-to-day life like for the ancient enemies of the Jedi, people that valued power over all? What was their training like, and what did they do in their functions? The Sith Order is a legacy of destruction, death, and violence, one that inspires stories of terror for generations across the stars. For thousands of years, the Sith have been hellbent on total dominion over the galaxy, trying again and again through vast armies, massive superweapons, or powerful dark side powers to achieve their goals. But what happens when they take off their cloaks and their helmets, put down their lightsabers, when the Sith aren't actively in the process of domination or destroying their enemies? What does their day-to-day life look like? Several days ago, we released a holocron talking all about the daily life of the Jedi, where we explored standard life for a Jedi inside the temple on Coruscant, and how the Guardians of Peace and Justice move throughout the mundane. Now has come the time to explore their ancient enemies, but this will be a lot trickier. The Jedi had the luxury of being in power for so long that they are able to have a standard routine. Very rarely has the Sith Order ever reached a period of such stability as the Jedi had, so the Sith's daily routines are going to be vastly different depending on their rank, their area of expertise, and especially what era they resided in. But today, we are going to be following the Master and Apprentice individually, and talk about what it would be like to become a Sith in each era. Before we begin though, there's a big sale on the Star Wars merch page for the holiday season, where site-wide is half off. So if you're interested in grabbing some designs for either yourself or a gift this holiday season, now would be a pretty good time to do so. With that said, let us begin. We will start with the Sith Apprentice, whose life had the most variety. Despite that statement though, life as a Sith Apprentice was not a fun one. Let's begin by assuming the apprentice in question has already been initiated and no longer requires long hours of torture and starvation to make them committed solely to the dark side. In the Old Republic, when the reconstituted Sith Empire was in full swing, it was all hands on deck most of the time for the apprentices. The Sith apprentices of the Empire lived almost militaristic lives, and training was more like a boot camp. During the Old Republic and the New Sith Wars, apprentices that were in line to become Sith Lords would be trained in the Academy on Korriban, the home of the ancient Sith. The actual training they went through is a bit vague. However, we have more concrete information on what Sith students actually did in the academies during the New Sith War, and can assume that their studies were similar. Most of our information will come from the first Darth Bane novel, Path of Destruction, as it dedicates a significant portion of the story to Bane's time and study under the Sith Masters on Korriban. There were technically 3 schools of Sith teaching: the Academy on Honoghr, which was training for Sith Marauders, the Academy on Umbara, which was for Sith Assassins, and the Academy on Korriban, which is where the most gifted students would be sent: potential Lords of the Sith. Daily routines constituted largely of 2 main classes, the first of which occurred very early in the morning and was lightsaber training. While the Jedi had the luxury of actual training lightsabers with stun blades, the Sith made do with blunt metal swords that were covered in poisonous barbs. These barbs had been taken from the native bugs of Korriban, and caused searing pain upon contact, followed by numbness, all in an effort to simulate getting struck by an actual lightsaber. Training began with the Academy's Blade Master, a Blade Master who ensured that all of the forms of the apprentices were achieved to perfection. The class would end with one student standing in a circle and openly issuing a challenge to another student. The second class of the day is of course the training in actual Force abilities. This is where the Sith were taught to manifest their hatred into an actual power, and the Academy on Korriban was gifted access to dark side abilities that the other 2 academies were not. Brutally in fact, the students were instructed to conduct these powers on one another, including conjuring Force lightning. The masters regularly exerted their power over the students in order to teach them the meanings of true strength and where they lie in the hierarchy. Not only this, but some abilities such as Force lightning had to be experienced before they could be mastered. Because of this, every Sith Academy had a medical wing that was filled with Bacta tanks. However, this was not a place where an apprentice wanted to be. Being placed in the medical wing not only meant that you would be missing out on other practices and training from the masters, but it also meant that you lost prestige. Those in the tanks were deemed weak and the bottom of the barrel. A lot was expected out of the Sith apprentices on Korriban. They were taught to scheme and connive, to lie and cheat, but never get caught. The most important thing was strength, and a Sith Lord was to show their strength at any opportunity. Prestige was everything. It meant life and death in a Sith Academy. Very few individuals in the academy ever made friends, as it was extremely cutthroat, and everyone assumed they were trying to undermine somebody else. While killing another apprentice was not necessarily allowed in the academy, students were only punished if they were caught. Relationships with their master was also extremely important, as if an apprentice could gain respect from a master, they would be placed in an excellent position in the army. Those with promise received more privileges, access to powers and rituals withheld from lesser students. None were allowed to fly under the radar. Either you were strong, held prestige and respect, which made you a target, or you were considered weak and worthless, which also made you a target. If Sith apprentices worked hard enough, they could receive one-on-one training from their masters, but this was never guaranteed. When Sith students at the academy were not training or scheming, they would be left to their own devices. This meant that many of them actually amassed a large group of loyal followers, and what Bane decided to do was to study the ancient records of the Sith. This was actually considered strange for the time, as the Brotherhood of Darkness, the reigning Sith, did not believe that they needed the ancient abilities. They considered the ancient masters to be fools, and that they only needed to perfect the Force abilities that they already knew, deeming the esoteric powers useless. Darth Bane, though, was obsessed with the ancient tomes, and would dive deep into the library on Korriban, learning of the culture of the past Sith, as well as their many abilities. Admittedly, Bane may have not gained much knowledge of the Force from these ancient tomes, but what he did gain was insight towards the powers of the dark side, learning how the Sith were supposed to operate, and finding flaws in the current system. But now that we've covered the apprentices in the academies, what was the daily comings and goings for the average Sith Lord? The biggest result of a Sith Lord's day was the speciality of the Sith in question. When it came to the alchemists and the scientists, you could find them barricaded in their laboratories or libraries for most hours of the day. Sith like Darth Nihilus of the New Sith Empire was a member of the Dark Council just under Darth Vitiate. These Sith often oversaw the war or were scheming for political gain. Nihilus herself was a Sith of the Arcane and spent her time deep in the study of ancient lore, experimenting on many species. Many of the Sith of the Old Republic era before Bane were absorbed in the war efforts. If they weren't trying to gain power by finding or enchanting a powerful artifact, you can bet they were making deals with governments or laying out plans for war. However, there were some Sith Lords who spent their time collecting trinkets and surrounding themselves with exquisite items in order to inspire jealousy, feeding their own power off of it. The typical life of a Sith became far more interesting during the Rule of Two era, the era where the Sith had evolved into something truly special. Apprentices of the Rule of Two had experiences far different from the Old Republic predecessors. Training was tailored individually to the specific master that they were studying under, this going for their routines as well. Most Sith masters had their apprentices live a double life just as they did. In some cases, this made life for an apprentice remarkably easier than it had once been, though it added the complication of keeping a secret life and identity. Importantly though, the Rule of Two Sith were not allowed to make attachments, but for a far different reason than the Jedi weren't allowed to. Masters would not allow their apprentices to have close friends, family, or lovers because they believed that it made them weak, as they could be targeted and destroyed, exploited. Apprentices did have lives of their own, but it was largely connected to the life of their master. For example, Darth Zana pretended to be the niece of Bane, and the two had fake names that they used in the public. Some Rule of Two masters, though, did not allow their apprentices to have double lives, using them more as assassins. Much of the time, Sith masters would maintain the life they had before they dedicated themselves to the Sith, but their old life would become the cover for their new life as a Dark Lord. This was the case for Tenebris, Plagueis, and Sidious, all of whom continued their lives as successful businessmen, scientists, and politicians. Leading a double life became more and more popular towards the end of the Rule of Two. During the first half of the Rule of Two, secrecy was paramount. This resulted in the first generations living more like doomsday preppers, holding out in hidden bunkers, fortresses, or temples, hiding from the eyes of the galaxy, and most importantly, the Jedi. In terms of training, Sith apprentices in the Rule of Two got far more well-rounded and hands-on training than the Sith initiates on Korriban ever did. The sad truth is that on Korriban, they were only taught to be battle-ready so that they could be shipped into war, while the Rule of Two Sith were not shackled by time, meaning the only limit they ever had was what their master wanted to teach them. and would need to learn enough so that they could overthrow their master. It could be said that the Rule of Two was the purest form of a Sith Lord's training. One master is to embody the power, and the apprentice is to crave it. Like microdoses of opium, the master will feed the apprentice just enough to ensure they kept growing and kept becoming more and more addicted, without giving them too much power where they could grow too fast. Masters and apprentices had a complicated dance. Neither one could ever really trust the other completely. A master could just as soon replace their apprentice as the apprentice could kill the master. Apprentices had to walk a very careful balance of keeping their master ignorant, never revealing their true strength, while also showing that they were not weak. And it were in these flames of deception where the truly remarkable Sith were born. A master and apprentice of the Rule of Two had the understanding that the most powerful Sith would rule. Before any of this though, the apprentice was expected to struggle, claw for each and every scrap of knowledge and power that they could glean. This was meant to make them strong, and in the end, the apprentices had it far more rough in this era than any other. The masters, though, in contrast, could spend their time as they pleased. What's remarkable is it wasn't necessarily the master's responsibility to train the apprentice, and therefore, they could train them as much as they saw fit, and use the majority of their own time towards personal goals. When they weren't scheming on how to destroy the Jedi, this usually meant meditation and the study of ancient knowledge. The collections of artifacts of the Rule of Two was massive, and it was inherited by each passing apprentice. This meant that the masters spent the majority of their time studying and practicing all of the new knowledge that they were once denied when they were the student. This took time and effort, and for a Sith to gain one new ability typically could take days, weeks, or even months locked away, meditating, or in their grand personal libraries. Masters also spent a great deal of time building network of spies and contacts in the Republic. Plagueis and Sidious directly spent a large amount of their time sweet-talking the upper echelons of galactic society, the wealthiest and most powerful beings in the galaxy. And this leads us into something that is seldom spoken of. Sith Lords lived a life of luxury. Some Sith Masters would even indulge, after being held back by their masters for so long. They would put riches and acclaim above even the Sith at times. They enjoyed a lavish lifestyle since they saw it as a reaping the benefits of being strong in the dark side. They held fine clothes, the best drinks, pleasurable company. Pockets of politicians and local authorities all came to them with all of their knowledge and influence. This caused many of the Rule of Two Sith to recruit their apprentices from high society, those who were already prestigious before they became a Dark Lord. But anyway, my friends, this is the day-to-day life and much of the training from the Sith eras from all across the Star Wars timeline. Were you shocked by any of this? And if you were a Dark Lord of the Sith, which era would you want to be trained under? Thank you as always so much for watching today's Holocron. May the Force be with you, and I hope you're having a great day.